Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Virginia Summy. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for another Civil War Doc Happy Hour. Our guest tonight is coming to us from Edinburgh, Scotland, is David Silkenat. And Silkenat, yeah, I pronounced that correctly. And his new book, well, first of all, he is the senior lecturer of American history at Edinburgh University, and he is the author of multiple books on civil war topics, including his most recent book, Scars on the Land, an environmental history of slavery in the American South. So it's through Oxford University Press. So I am going to turn it over to him and let him tell us about his book, and then we'll open it up for questions. So David, thank you so much for joining us in the middle of the night.
Yes, it is 1 a.m. here, so I'm liberally interpreting the happy hour more of a nightcap than a happy hour, but so be it. So I'm going to see if I can share some slides here to show you some somewhat pretty pictures.
There you go.
All right, try again. Good. Right, you should be seeing.
Got it.
Good. All right, and there we go. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to talk about Scars on the Land. This was a very difficult book to write in many ways, in part because the themes of the book were so much in the headlines while I was writing it. I was writing it, in the midst of sort of the apex, if you will, of the Black Lives Matter movement and of the growing awareness of the global climate crisis, and it emerged from my thinking about how these things are related, how our current environmental crisis and our current reckoning with the history and legacy of slavery and race, both in the United States and around the world, how those were related. And my thinking on this began, I think, started with Hurricane Katrina in many ways, thinking about how the destruction of that hurricane was built upon the ways in which class and race were shaped in Louisiana, and thinking about what were the historical roots of this kind of entanglement between slavery and race on one hand and the environment on the other. As Ginny said, I'm a Civil War historian, and I've written several books over the past decade that look at different aspects of the Civil War. I wrote a book about suicide, divorce, and debt in the Civil War era, which was a happy, uplifting book that reflected my career in graduate school.
Virginia, can you mute them?
I think I just muted the person who was. I wrote a book about refugees in the Civil War. It's all right. And then most recently, I wrote a book about surrender in the Civil War. So I've been writing about Civil War era topics for many years. So that was a literature and sources I knew very well. But one thing I really needed to learn in writing this book about the environmental history of slavery was just a huge body of knowledge and methodology about how to write environmental history. And so that was a real learning process for me, how to bring to bear the expertise I had on the history of slavery in the American South and the history of the Civil War era, and then sort of learn all this material about the environment and about science that I had to sort of get a grips with in order to write this book. And in doing so, I recognized part of some of the reasons why this book hadn't been written yet, because these are bodies of scholarships that hadn't really been in his conversation as much as I thought they could have been. And so part of what this book is trying to do is trying to say what does happen when we take these two bodies of scholarship and have them talk to one another. And Scars on the Land asks basically two big questions. The first question it asks is, how did the environment shape the lives of people who were enslaved? And I'll just start by quoting a line that's actually in the introduction from the book. It's by a man by the name of William Anderson, who was enslaved in Mississippi, and he was describing why more people from Mississippi did not run away from slavery there. And he says, "It is almost impossible for slaves to escape from that part of the South. There are a great many things to encounter in escaping: large and small rivers, lakes, panthers, bears, snakes, alligators, white and black men, bloodhounds, guns, and above all, the dangers of starvation." You know, what that passage and others like it told me was that embedded within the violence of slavery was barriers to freedom created by the environment. That part of the torture embedded within slavery as an institution came from the environmental conditions in which enslaved people were living and working. So they were, working in the hottest part of the day in the summer sun, and dealing with the effects of heat and dehydration. They are dealing with cold and drafty slave quarters in winter, in which they're waking up with frostbite on their toes. They are dealing with working in rice plantations, working in water, and having snakes, swimming in and among them. They're dealing with working with animals, both domesticated animals and wild animals, that were barriers to their freedom and helped to keep them enslaved. We can think about the role, for instance, that dogs played in pursuing fugitive slaves. We can think about the ways in which enslaved people suffered the worst consequences when hurricanes hit, or when plantations flooded. And so there's all these ways in which the lives of the enslaved are shaped fundamentally and violently by the environmental conditions in which they are working. At the same time, I argue that enslaved people had a tremendous knowledge of the environment, and that knowledge helped them to survive their lives in bondage. This included knowledge about how to hunt and how to fish and how to trap, how to navigate through the woods to go and see friends and family, how to use those natural environments sometimes to escape from slavery, sometimes to establish refugee communities in swamps. And we know a great deal more than we used to about refugee communities, these maroon communities in the Great Dismal Swamp, in swamps in South Carolina and swamps in Louisiana. And all of that developed in part because enslaved people developed an understanding about how to use the environment to protect themselves. And so here we see a depiction of enslaved people fleeing to a swamp, but at the same time being chased by dogs. And so it demonstrates both the ways in which enslaved people are using the environment as a shelter, but also the ways in which enslavers are using the environment to track down and pursue enslaved people. So part of the book is trying to explain the various ways in which the lives of the enslaved are shaped by the environment. The other big question the book is trying to address is how slavery as an institution shaped the Southern environment. And here the argument I make is that enslavers saw their wealth and power primarily in terms of the people that they owned. the wealth that was contained in human people, not in necessarily in the land that they owned, and that they saw the land that they owned fundamentally as disposable. They saw the land as disposable, they saw trees as disposable, they saw rivers and lakes as disposable, that the natural resources of the South could be exploited and used on the supposition that there was always more land to be exploited. And one of the things we see this very early on in the history of American slavery, where planters in Virginia recognized that it is cheaper and more efficient for them to use up the land that they are growing tobacco on the supposition that they can always use their enslaved labor to cut down a forest and plant more tobacco further west. And the same happens with cotton and with other crops, where there is a desire to always expand slavery into the next frontier, to go and use the land in such a way as to make it no longer profitable, on the supposition that they can always acquire more land. And that really was a shift in how agriculture worked. It grew. Planters in colonial the Chesapeake, changed how people thought about how agriculture worked. It was different than how agriculture worked generally in Europe or in northern states, all of which practiced crop rotation and trying to enrich the soil and all these kinds of techniques that were designed to keep the soil fertile. Slavery, by the nature of the economics of it and the nature of the way in which people understood their wealth to be in people and not in land, to see the land as disposable. Which helps to explain why white Southern enslavers were so desirous of spreading slavery further west, right? This demand for having new land for the next cotton frontier helps to explain so much of how slavery grew, especially in the first half of the 19th century. Thinking about the ways in which the demands of slavery for the next frontier that helped to drive Indian removal, it helped to drive the war against Mexico, it helped to drive the internal slave trade. We think about why this domestic slave trade that ships 1 million people from the upper South to the lower South between 1800 and 1860. The engine that's driving that, in part, is this environmental worldview that sees the land as disposable. And planters recognized this. They understood what they were doing. That people would come into them and say, why don't you try letting your fields go fallow? Why don't you try using fertilizer on your soil instead of going and cutting down the next forest? And they say, yes, we could, but that doesn't make sense for us. We can always find new land. And so there is a destructive environmental ethos that's embedded, I argue, within slavery in the American South, and it helps to explain much of the transformative effects that slavery has on the landscape. There is a sort of leading edge that slavery creates, in which enslaved people are cutting down forests to create new plantation. And there is a bleeding edge behind, there's an edge, sort of a trailing edge behind it, in which there's the sort of aftermath of slavery in some places where their land is seen as so used up, it is no longer viable for any kind of cultivation. There's a really wonderful description by Charles Ball, who was an enslaved man, who was one of the sort of main characters, if you will, in the book. And he describes being sold from Maryland, where he was born, down into the lower South, and describes passing through Virginia a generation or so after the sort of height of the tobacco boom in Virginia, and describing lands that had once been the epicenter of the American tobacco industry, but were now sort of desolate and barren, which he argues was the product of the way that which slavery as an institution affected the land. And so I just wanted to give you some examples of this from the book, just to illustrate some of the ways in which the lives of the enslaved were shaped by the environment. But I also want to talk a bit about sources, because one of the things I tried very hard to do in this book was try to figure out what sources would give me the most insight into both the effect that the environment had on slavery and the lives of the enslaved, and slavery had on the environment. And obviously, one major source I used were people like Charles Ball, who had written fugitive slave narratives. They're Frederick Douglass, Harry Jacobs. So they all talk about the environment in various ways. Solomon Northup is a wonderful chronicler of the environment in Louisiana, for instance. So I read those sources, but I read them in new ways. And obviously, these are sources that have been, many of them have been well picked over, but reading them from an environmental lens, I think revealed new aspects to those texts. The other kinds of sources that I found really quite valuable were the accounts of naturalists, scientists, early environmentalists, if you want to call them that, who visited the American South, who were interested in trees or rocks or birds. Here's John James Audubon, who was famous as an ornithologist, who traveled throughout the South looking at birds, and he encountered slavery along the way and made a number of observations about the lives of the enslaved, and especially the lives of Maroons, the encounters of a Maroon community in Louisiana. And I found that they were some of the best observers of how slavery as an institution affected the land. All right, so let's give them some examples. One of the examples in the book is of the turpentine industry. Turpentine was a very prominent industry, especially in North Carolina, in which turpentine is extracted from longleaf pine, and you can see that here. It's extracted from longleaf pine a bit the same way that sort of maple syrup is extracted, except that instead of attaching a bucket to the tree, what you do is actually you carve a bucket into the tree itself. And you can see that a bit on both of these pictures. At the bottom, you cut a cavity into the tree to collect the raw turpentine. And then you cut these gashes into the tree that causes the turpentine to then flow down into the cavity. And these gashes have to be recut periodically as they dry up. And you can see that here on some of these trees that the gashes are getting, notches are being further and further up the tree. This kind of work was done almost exclusively by enslaved labor, starting in the colonial period, but really picking up pretty extensively in the 1830s and 1840s. Turpentine was used for an all number of products, but especially for naval stores, a variety of kinds of things that can be made from turpentine. And the work was extraordinarily hard. It requires backbreaking physical labor. It requires being exposed to turpentine fumes, which are toxic. It leaves you covered in raw turpentine, which leaves sort of layers of residue on your body that would then sort of build up over the course of a season. So you'd be, it would take you until you were able to clean yourself properly to really wash all of it off. You were in danger of forest fires because these turpentine trees had a habit of catching on fire and sometimes exploding. So it's difficult, dangerous work for the enslaved men who were sent in the forests to do this. And one of the things that happened when the turpentine industry really took off in the 1830s and 1840s, which it did for a variety of economic reasons, is that enslavers told the men that they sent into the forests to collect the turpentine, to collect as much turpentine as they could, to cut as many of these gashes into the tree as they needed to maximize production. And they did this knowing that the process of doing so would kill the trees. You can cultivate turpentine slowly from trees and do it for generations, or you can do it extensively and do it quickly. And they decided to destroy what were millions of acres of turpentine forest for a quick profit. And most of these turpentine forests, which were very extensive in North Carolina and other parts of the South, are basically gone now. And it's largely a product of a very short period of time in which they were intensively extracted, and extracted using enslaved labor. Another industry, another way in which enslaved labor is used for environmental destructive behavior was in mining. Some of you may know this, but others of you may not. The first real gold rush in the United States was not in California in 1849. It was in Georgia and North Carolina in 1829. And this was a gold rush that was immensely profitable. If it weren't for the California one, this is the one we would be talking about all the time. And much of the work that was done in these gold mines was done by enslaved labor, who are men who are going underground, working in very dangerous conditions, digging tunnels, some of which collapsed, some of which killed the miners. It was brutal, difficult work underground to extract the gold ore. And when they extracted the gold ore, they then brought it above ground. And the way that they processed the gold ore was by using what was called a rocker, that involved using lots of water to help separate the ore from the rest, the gold from the rest of the rock. And it used mercury to do so. So you're using mountain streams and mercury to separate the gold from the rock, which is toxic to the enslaved people who are working it. It's toxic to the rivers. And people who are visiting these gold mining communities in Georgia and North Carolina describe them as desolate wastelands, that the trees on neighboring mountains have all been cut down. The rivers, which were once pristine, become polluted, that they were once teeming with fish, there are none, and that the people who are working in the mines, many of them are dying as a consequence. And so I think it's sort of this, we tend to think of slavery primarily as an agricultural labor system, but one of the things I found was, that slavery was remarkably adaptable to different environmental conditions. And as I think all of us know, the South is home to a variety of different kinds of ecosystems, different kinds of environments, and each of them slavery found a niche in each of them. And the final example I want to give is of a plantation called Belle Chase Plantation. That was a sugar plantation not far from New Orleans, along the Mississippi. And like most plantations along the Mississippi, was protected from flooding by a long system of levees that were built almost exclusively with enslaved labor. And the levees at Belle Chase Plantation broke. And when the plantation levees broke, it flooded the plantation, it flooded the slave quarters, the few possessions that the enslaved people had washed away, and the plantation owner decided he had to sell his property because the crop was ruined, including some of his land, his farm equipment, and the people he enslaved. And he had an enormous auction in the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans, which is the site of many famous slave auctions. It makes an appearance in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we see a depiction here of the auctions in the hotel, and we see the bill of sale here on the right. And what we see in this case and in dozens of other like it is we see that the enslaved community is paying the highest price for an environmental disaster. This flood, and of course all environmental disasters are really man-made disasters of a way. You know, they are paying the highest price for this disaster. And if you look at the list of names, you can see, you know, they are listed. Sometimes you can make out who the families are, how old they are, what their careers were. And we don't know what happened to any of these men and women and children who were auctioned off this day because the plantation levees broke and the plantation flooded. We do know, however, what happened to the plantation owner. It was Judah P. Benjamin, who later gets elected to the US Senate and is later on Secretary of State and Treasury and War, I think, for Jefferson Davis. And I think that sort of speaks to the ways in which enslaved people often suffer the worst effects of environmental disasters. Just thinking about then, you know, since you guys are primarily interested in the Civil War itself, the final chapter of the book looks at emancipation. And what I argue there is that environment played a huge role in how emancipation unfolded. That enslaved people used the knowledge they had developed over 200 years of bondage, inherited knowledge about how to navigate through forests, how to navigate across rivers, how to negotiate around wild animals to escape to Union lines. If we want to understand some of those processes, we need to understand the environmental knowledge that enslaved people had and knowledge that they shared with the Union Army. If we think about the role that enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, gave to the Union Army, especially in 1861, 1862, serving as scouts, serving as spies, helping military units navigate what to them was a foreign environment. That was profoundly important knowledge. And so I think we need to think about what an environmental history of emancipation looks like. And I try to offer some directions in the book, but I'm sure there's more work that needs to be done. And even beyond this, we need to think more about how simple things like how rainy a particular season was, or how high the river levels were, how that shapes emancipation. I think many of you may have seen this image before. It's a very famous picture of enslaved people fleeing to freedom across a river. One thing, though, that's clear, and it's even clear from this picture, is that the river levels are much lower than they usually are because that particular year had something of a drought. And those kinds of environmental conditions enabled these enslaved people to cross this river. If you were to imagine the river when it is 3 feet higher, this picture would not have happened. And so I think giving greater understanding not only to the actions and choices people are making, but the ways in which those choices are shaped by the landscape, shaped by the weather, will help us, I think, understand an aspect of how emancipation unfolded that we haven't really given full credit to yet. But I'll stop there so we can have a conversation, because I think that's far more interesting than me babbling. So.
Well, thank you, David. I know right now my mind is kind of connecting dots all over the place with all this, but I will open it up to everybody else first. If I have any questions.
Hi, David. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Carrie Lee. I'm sorry.
Sorry, and there's so much noise behind me, but I am so excited to read this. It sounds incredible. It sounds like something that the field has been needing for a long time. And my brain was kind of going everywhere too. I was specifically thinking of the old enclosure debates and kind of the topics that Stephen Hahn wrote about so many years ago, and was wondering how you how that kind of factored into what you were finding in the pre-war landscape.
Yeah, that's a really important aspect to all of this. And so when we think about how land is divided and how land is understood as a resource, one of the things that struck people as very visitors to the South as very odd was they never penned their animals. All right, we tend to think about how the ways in which the structure of agriculture is about, you keep animals in particular locations and you keep fields in particular places, and you divide land, and some land is held in common and some land is held privately. But one of the ways in which Southern husbandry evolved in different ways than it did in the rest of the United States or in Europe was this insistence on not restricting animals, which led many visitors to deride Southern animals as being inferior. They said Southern cows are worse than cows anywhere else. Southern pigs are worse. And part of the sort of understanding about why this particular system developed was in part related to the role that slavery had in how husbandry worked and who was given responsibility for that. So Frederick Douglass, for instance, talks about being in charge of animals at various points in time when he was an enslaved child. And it also leads to feral communities of animals. We have today in the South, in certain parts, especially in places like Arkansas, feral communities of pigs that are descendants of pigs that were allowed to roam freely. And I think this is an outgrowth of the sort of mentality of slavery about how you fence in land or don't fence in land, don't fence in animals, and you don't fence in people in certain ways. And there are ways in which enslaved peoples could exploit this. They could, for instance, maroon communities and swamps would often prey upon pigs and cows that were allowed to graze in the swamp. And so I think one of the things, the struggles I had in writing this book, is that there were lots of parts of this story had been told before, but they hadn't necessarily connected all the dots, right? I think there had been a lot, for instance, of agricultural history that had written about the choices made on a field and the ways in which Southern agriculture worked and the ways in which soil erosion worked. But they never asked the question, what happened to the soil that eroded? Where did it go? What effects did that have? And so part of the story I'm trying to do in this book is to sort of connect the story of enslaved agriculture and the particular ways in which enslaved agriculture worked, with what effect that had on the broader ecosystem. And to be sure, this is a very complex story, and I'm only really kind of scratching the surface, in part because this is, I was trying to do something quite relatively new, and I'm hoping that other people sort of take this up and do a better job than I've done, but that I'm sort of laying the groundwork for that. At least that's my hope.
It's funny you asked that, Kaylee, because I just had written down while he was talking, I wrote fence laws down. I one of the classes I developed for the honors college at UNCG is a history of Greensboro, North Carolina, and the surrounding areas. And the idea that we go back to fence laws, and just last week we talked about Levi Coffin. His job was to go into the woods in what's now Guilford County, hogs in there he found, enslaved people who were running away. And then I say, put a pin in fence laws, because we'll talk about it when we talk about textiles in a few weeks as well. I guess it's more of a comment than a question. Like I said, my mind is just kind of pinging around right now. But Ethan, I know your work on naval stores, so I'm sure you have.
That was a really interesting part to me. It really has to do, and why I started looking at naval stores, and it really connects to this book, and really even the title "Scars on the Land" is really poignant to me. The neighborhood I grew up in, for instance, used to be it was a place where turpentine was harvested from. It was just used to be a pine forest.
Sure.
Growing up, there are these all throughout the neighborhood, kind of in the woods, in some areas, there were just these random, what I used to, growing up, just random little ponds that I would fish out of as a kid and things. It wasn't until I was older that I realized that those were tar kilns that had just been abandoned and filled up with water, and kind of I don't know, I have really kind of a personal connection to that, and just thinking about how that really ties into the fact that we look at slavery as something, I think, is something that's so distant and so removed, or so far removed from it, but and kind of the legacies of it are kind of there are physical legacies that are still visible today, which is fascinating to me.
Yes, I mean, one of the areas I point to in the conclusion of the book is to think about, okay, what are the legacies of this today, and if we look at the ways in which the environment and race intersect in the American South in the 20th century and in the 21st century, we find profound evidence that Black communities have bad environmental outcomes, and these are not accidental, right? I mean, I think this is, if you look at like Cancer Alley, for instance, in Louisiana, which the heart of the plantation belt becomes the petrochemical wasteland. I don't know if that's probably an overstatement, but environmentally it is kind of a wasteland that has been polluted, and so the environment has been harmed, and the people who live there have suffered tremendous consequences. If we think about the other, the ways in which hurricanes disproportionately affect Black communities and communities of color, and thinking forward about what the future holds for environmental justice, the scars on the land that I'm talking about in this book, the scars are faded, but they're not gone, and if you can see them if you look closely in the land today, or go fishing in them, as the case may be. and the turpentine, the naval stores industry is fascinating. I mean, one of the main sources I used for that was Frederick Law Olmsted. Carrie Lee, I know you've used him before in your work. He's a journalist, but he's also a landscape architect. He designed Central Park later, and so he understands trees, and he understands the way in which landscapes works. And he goes down and he's going down the midst, and he says, look, they're destroying this forest. This will be gone within a generation because of how extensively they were extracting turpentine from those trees. And he says, once these trees are gone, the things that replace them, there are different kinds of pines replace them, but they're worthless. Not to say the loblolly pine is worthless, but it's kind of worthless, at least as a industrial pursuit. And in North Carolina, turpentine naval stores was in 1860 probably the largest industry, or at least in the top 2 or 3 biggest industries in the state, making just ridiculous amounts of money. And the choice was made for short-term profits over long-term interests of forests. And I see that sort of pattern sort of replicated across the South in a variety of other industries. In iron production and charcoal production, obviously in agriculture, when you're talking about cotton or tobacco, you're finding similar kinds of devastation left in the wake of enslaved labor.
Yeah, I just want to echo Ethan's idea that when I started this book, and I have to admit I haven't finished it yet.
That's okay.
But yeah, the personal connection that I'm seeing to this, Matthew might be able to back me up here. We're both Western North Carolinians, and so to like I said right before we started, to open the book and almost immediately see Roveton, where I was born, and Gold Hill, where East Rowan, where I grew up, in the same sentence, was like,
I wrote that for you.
Wow. The effects that particularly industrial slavery has had, like, literally in my backyard. It was just like, wow.
One of the things I wanted to do, the South is obviously a huge and varied geography. I wanted to be able to zoom into very particular places and witness changes, because you can't talk about everywhere all the time over, the book covers roughly 200 years in the lives of, millions of enslaved people. You can't create narratives out of that unless you zoom into particular places and times. So picking, this turpentine forest and that gold mine, this cotton plantation, this riverboat, those kinds of specific areas and specific people, I felt that was really necessary in order to give meat to the story and to personalize it, because I care deeply about the trees and the rivers and the forests and the furry animals and things, but the horror of the book is really about what it does to the people, and I really wanted to make sure that the enslaved experience was really front and center on every page, right? And so whenever possible, I foregrounded individual enslaved experiences and the ways in which they were interacting with the environment.
I really am enjoying how you incorporate industrial slavery here too, because I think it's a topic that has flown a bit under the radar. I guess I did want to ask, because I'm a railroad history guy. Did you intentionally leave out antebellum railroads, or was it just was it something you couldn't get to given your space limitations?
I that it was something I thought about, and the question I had was what chapter it was going to be in, and figuring out how to structure this book. It's structured around different environmental phenomena. So there's a chapter on soil, and there's a chapter on rivers, and there's a chapter on trees, and a chapter on animals and swamps. And I couldn't figure out where railroads would fit into that necessarily. So it was easy for me to talk about mining because that went in the soil chapter, and easy to talk about logging because it fit into the tree. But I think there's definitely room for work to be done there. I think part of what I was hoping in this book was less to be, an exhaustive environmental treatment of slavery, because I don't think that's possible. It was really to sort of open up some questions and some frameworks for people to play with and hopefully build on, more than anything else. As a scholar, my hope ultimately is that I'm proven wrong about almost everything I do, because other people have decided to take what I've done, build on it, and find a more nuanced or more persuasive arguments for everything I've done. So I think there's definitely room for writing an environmental history of railroads and the way that slavery factors into their construction and the destruction that railroad construction, thinking about the main thing that comes to mind, and it's not slavery exactly, it's post-emancipation, but Scott Reynolds Nelson, I know he's been in this chair before. His book on both on railroads and then his book on John Henry, I think speaks to that relationship quite well.
But it is so fascinating to think that, before coal and other fossil fuels, wood was it.
Yes.
I mean, when you talked about steamboats, I hadn't really thought about steamboats. But the devastation in the forests along the rivers where steamboats operated because they had to log them for fuel. I mean, it's truly fascinating.
Yeah, that was something obviously everyone knows about steamboats and the relationship between steamboats and slavery and cotton. I think that was, but then figuring out, okay, that these steamboats are all or mostly powered by wood, and that they make choices about how to design the steamboats, and they said speed is of utmost importance, and so we're going to produce steamboats that burn a lot of wood to maximize speed upriver, and a couple of miles an hour added speed is worth cutting down a forest to do it, and that the people who are cutting down the forests for the steamboats, they are enslaved people, and who are loading it onto the ships, they are enslaved people, and that cutting down those forests has lots of consequences. It has consequences obviously for the trees. It has consequences for the animals of various kinds that live in those forests. It has consequences for sort of opening up that land now for agriculture, and therefore more slavery. It has consequences for enslaved people escaping. There's a bit in the book where one enslaved person is talking about how escaping from slavery has changed over the 1840s and 1850s, and he says, it used to be we had lots of forests here in which enslaved people could use the forest as a means to escape. Now those forests have all been cut down, which gives runaway slaves nowhere to hide, and gives slave catchers on horseback that much more power, because they have the hide on horseback, they have the speed, and they have the ability to run down enslaved people, and sometimes use dogs to run down enslaved people who are running away. And so that the the cascade of effects that happens from cutting down these forests is profound. It changes the contents of the rivers, right? When you cut down trees that are on riverbanks, it changes the temperature of the water. It changes the animals, the fish that can live in the water, the fish, the frogs, the various other kinds of animals that depend on those waterways. Those change fundamentally when we cut down all the riverside trees. So there are sort of deep ecological effects that emerge from this, which makes you look at steamboats in a very different way. I think it's made to look at steamboats in a different way. I don't know about the rest of people.
So I wanted to just give you this comment, David, just as I'm listening to you again, it's making me think so many of the really big themes throughout Southern history. And I think this is a really important contribution to not only the westward expansion debate and kind of the Turner thesis and the idea of these slaveholders as just absolute imperial capitalists, just able to completely like burn the land they're on and move on whenever they want. And I think that you're actually confirming a lot of the old economic history as well. It made me think that you're essentially confirming Gavin Wright's labor lord to landlord thesis. And it also made me think about the current issues with the lack of infrastructure. And I think that's what's left out of a lot of our discussions about capitalism, particularly in the South, is that we talk about capitalism and then we never talk about the flip side of how it develops in the South, is that there's this almost inverse relationship between a lack of infrastructure and a lack of things that the state does for people. And so I think I'm just, this has got my mind going. So I'm really, really excited to read it. Thank you so much for staying up late for us. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. One of the perils of being a transatlantic American historian is that all the fun stuff happens at crazy hours of the night. So I'm kind of used to it by now.
I'm also enjoying how you're, reading some of the sources in new ways. And the vignette about Charles Ball saying goodbye to his dog.
I know that was tragic.
I mean, I'm familiar with Tyler Perry's work. I'd heard him talk about attack dogs. It had just never crossed my mind that enslaved people had dogs as pets. And that I had to put the book down and walk away. I mean, that blew my mind. It was really fascinating.
Well, his dog, who, he is called Truman. He loves his dog. There's points in which he is sold away from a family. He's allowed to keep his dog. And the dog, is not just a companion that gives his life meaning. The dog is profoundly useful. That, if you are an enslaved person and you are trying to hunt and you don't have a gun, some enslaved people had guns. Charles Ball actually had a gun, but most don't. Having a dog makes hunting that much easier, right? And so they have very conflicted ideas about some animals, right? So like dogs, the dogs are both an enslaved person's best friend, but they're also their worst mortal enemy. There's also similar descriptions where enslaved people are talking about mules, and there's one WEPA interview, so it's done in the 1930s, so decades later, where a very elderly enslaved person is talking about this mule that he had when he was like 10, and just how much he loved this mule and what the mule was called. And the interviewer's like, why do you remember a mule from 70 years ago? And he says, no, like, you don't understand. The mule was the closest thing I had to a friend. The mule and I worked together all the time. I know my mule. And then, so there's ways in which animals were a very important part of the lives of the enslaved, both in terms of keeping them in bondage, but also in terms of giving their life meaning.
Thanks, David. When I teach or thanks, Matthew, sorry, when I teach slavery to my students, I start crying in a couple of instances. One is mothers being separated from children. And now, David, thanks to this book, I have to add dogs too. So
Well, there's also, thinking of tragic dog stories, there's a bit in the book where I talk about enslavers killing their enslaved people's dogs. And in fact, both Thomas Jefferson and George Washington have their overseers kill the dogs of their enslaved people because they're preying on livestock or something. Who knows? But what that would mean to an enslaved person, having a dog taken away from them, it's quite profound. Obviously, it's not the same as a family member, but it's tragic nonetheless.
yeah. We have just a few more minutes. If anybody has anything else.
So who were some of your favorite environmental historians as you're reading the field kind of anew again? That's always interesting.
Geez. That's I mean, if I had to pick one, I'd probably say Tim Silver, who teaches at App State. And I think you may note he's written, along with Judkin Browning, an environmental history of the Civil War. And he had written previously about southern forests and mountains. And I really liked his work. And the book that he wrote with Judkin Browning, I thought was phenomenal. I was also very grateful when I read it, and it came out just a couple of years before this did, that they didn't really talk about emancipation very much. So they sort of left that open for me. Thinking about things though I read that were deeply influential to me years ago, reading William Cronin, like everybody else, was an experience in graduate school that really sort of opened my eyes to sort of thinking about the landscape in new ways, and about how the landscape and reading about people were important. I think reading Megan Kate Nelson was very important to me. Especially her early work, which was much more, all of her work is environmental, but especially Ruined Nation and the book she wrote on the swamp were very important. There's the question in the chat about the point about the Mexican War. Sure. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that enslavers are constantly looking for the next place for slavery to expand. That they know that the ways in which they're using the land is destructive, and that they need territory to expand into. And so if you look for who is pushing most for war against Mexico, it's often white Southern enslavers who are pushing for it. And part of their mindset is that slavery as an institution needs to expand geographically into virgin soil. And they talk about this not only in the context of wars against native peoples, they talk about this in the context of the war against Mexico. They talk about this in the context of secession, when they are talking about why they hate the Republican Party so much, and why they demand for slavery to expand into the West, and why they oppose free soil. It's because they see their understanding of slavery as an institution is as one that needs a frontier to expand into. And without that, it will stagnate and die the way the land had stagnated and died because they had over-tilled it. And so, part of the voracious appetite for land, I think, is emerging from this ways in which they're understanding the land as disposable.
Do you think it would have been the same if slavery had not continued in the South? Did slavery enable the level of environmental damage just by virtue of the institution itself and the incentives?
Well, so one of the things that happened, and I talk about this in the sort of last chapter of the book, is that when slavery ended, with emancipation and with the reconstruction of Southern agriculture, lots of things change. For instance, formerly enslaved people, freed people, stopped doing lots of the kinds of supportive labor to transform the environment they used to do. They say, look, we will grow cotton here, but we're not going to cut down that forest so we can grow cotton somewhere else next year. That's not our job. So there's that expanse nature is gone. They start to use fertilizer. The South goes from the part of the country that uses the least fertilizer to the place that uses the most fertilizer. And they talk about how do you revitalize this soil that has been over-farmed sometimes for generations. The answer is fertilizer, but they end up sort of using more and more of it. And obviously that leads to all kinds of cycles of indebtedness for black sharecroppers, but for white sharecroppers in general, and that leads to the populist movement and all other kinds of things. But there is, significant changes in the ways in which Southern agriculture works and the ways in which people are thinking about the land, thinking about how sharecroppers are often thinking about, and people who own the land that sharecroppers are working on. They're thinking about having a piece of land and working on it for year after year after year, not, oh, we will work on this land and then we're going to move to Texas, or next we're going to move to wherever. So there's a real, I think, dynamic change that happens with emancipation. And obviously there's tons of other factors that are involved as well, but I think there's a really marked change.
Well, with that, we are just a couple minutes past 9 or 2. Yes. If there's nothing else, David, thank you so much for staying up into the wee hours to join us. And I know I'm speaking for more than myself when I'm saying thank you for writing this, because it has just, taken what has seemed like a familiar topic and just shed it in an entirely new light. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I know we all have enjoyed it as well. So thank you.